Immediately after the conclusion of Operation Maelstrom, the Ayuk and the Titans were on the verge of ruin. Well, actually the Titans were almost wiped out, and even though the Ayuk won the battle, the organization was in a very bad shape, with most of its pilots missing in action or completely out of service. Camille and Char being two of the heaviest losses. But exactly here is where Haman's plan begins to unfold. With Axis Xion standing at full force, and with the opposition at its lowest, she can now lead Xion to a new era of glory where they can be considered again a force to be reckoned, and the Earth Federation wouldn't have a chance against them. Here is where Haman Khan rebrands Axis Xion as Neo Xion, and 11 days after Operation Maelstrom ended, the first Neo Xion war begins. And with that premise, one would believe that Double Zeta Gundam would grab Zeta's Gundam momentum, crank it up to 11 and deliver us a brutal story that would exceed our wildest expectations and take to newer heights the myths of the real robots and the new tapes. Too bad that didn't happen. Or well, not exactly in that way. Double Zeta Gundam is considered a very weird series because of the tonal shift in the first half of the story. Here, Yoshiyuki Tomino kind of trolled us with his now classic bait and switch mood swing, where he finishes a story in a very dark way and starts the new one in a very light and comical style. A lot of people were angry with the change of mood for the first couple of episodes, and this was understandable, since the ending of Zeta, even though it was very well executed and kind of shocking but in a very good way, it was also very grim and bitter. And we have to remember that Gundam is a show that it's mostly aimed at kids and as a means to sell toys, so probably Tomino decided to cut back a little bit in Double Zeta. I couldn't really find out if it was his decision or if there was executive meddling, but I think that he decided by himself, given the fact that by this time the franchise was very successful and with a very big following despite its violence. So yeah, to say that the first couple of episodes are not what you would expect in a Gundam series is quite the understatement. Even though we have a powerful team of mobile suits comprised by the Zeta Gundam, the Mark II, the Hyakushiki, and a little bit later the Behemoth Double Zeta Gundam, one of the most formidable ensembles of mobile suits in all of Universal Century, the first arcs are very goofy and full of nonsensical moments. Even the villains look and act like a Saturday morning cartoon villain. And don't get me wrong, I love the 80s-tastic look of Kara Sun. I mean, she's the embodiment of 80s fashion and flamboyance, but she is no Paptimus. Not even the romantic Mashi Marcello. So what happened? Why depart from the formula that worked? Well, I have my theories that range from Tomino being totally punk rock to a more meta way to understand the first episodes. Because as a matter of fact, the second half of Double Zeta returns to the War is Hell theme and the story gets darker and creepier. Villains that started goofy show us the real side and are quite frightening. From human experiments to cloning to, you guessed it, cyber new tips. The final arcs of Double Zeta are very interesting. So, brothers and sisters, my name is Absa, and it's time now to explore the two sides of Double Zeta Gundam, a series where Tomino once again subverts our expectations and expands the range of what we can expect from a Gundam story. As I was saying, the first couple of episodes, the first 25 episodes to be exact, are a mixture of very stupid plot points and almost zero consequences of any kind. The villains appear, fight and disappear without importance. Enemies don't feel like enemies, they feel more like obstacles to obtain something or for Yura to make fun of. And as I said before, maybe it was Tomino's way to tell us that not everything has to be super serious in Gundam. That if you look at life with a certain lens, even in war you can find relief. That, he just got bored of all the drama and decided that he wanted to direct a funny series. And I have to be honest, the first episodes are very hard to watch. They feel super inconsequential and almost boring. Jura is the complete opposite of Camille, and his friends also make matter worse by being actually very bad friends who would betray anybody if that gave them some kind of reward. I slowly worked my way through the first half of Double Zeta Gundam, and I didn't drop it because the Zeta Gundam was still relevant and I wanted to see that mobile suit in action. Also, Bright Noah was still the captain of the Argama and a key player of the AUG, so I kept watching the series. And then, just when I was getting used to the comical tone of the series, episode 26 comes and everything changes again. I'm going to enter spoiler territory right now, so proceed with caution. Episode 26 is very weird because that's exactly when Double Zeta returns to the more dark and mature tone of Zeta. Here we have Haman Karn shooting Jura's sister Lane, and from here on everything that happens feels much more Gundam-y. So was it just a bad start that Tomino course corrected when he saw the backlash of the more adult fans? Maybe, probably, but as a good Gundam fan, after a while of overthinking everything, I came up with a different way to interpret all of those events. You see, there's a certain mental disorder that can develop after a person is exposed to a traumatic event. And we can all agree that war is a very traumatic event. This is called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD in short. By the time of the events of Double Zeta Gundam, Bright Noah had already been an active part of the 1-year war and the Grips conflict, so his mental health is probably not in the best shape. And I'm not suggesting that Bright has PTSD per se, just that this mental disorder hinders the way you perceive reality. On the other hand, there's this saying that goes that there are some events that when they happen, you don't know whether to laugh or to cry. So with that in mind, what if all of the first part of Double Zeta Gundam is how Bright perceived the situation? So instead of being sad for the loss of his comrades, he just slipped into this little insanity where he perceives everything as funny, as something to laugh off instead of crying. If you couple this with the fact that protagonist Yura is only 14 years old and has not really lost his childlike wonder and innocence, we can come up with this idea that all of the first 25 episodes are how more or less Bright and Yura are seeing and perceiving the events that are happening in front of them. That's why Mashi Marcello seems super silly. That's why Glammy Toro doesn't look at all frightening. That's why Bright seems too worried when the Argama is being attacked by oranges. If we rewatch those episodes with that idea in mind, it makes a little bit more sense why everything was so foolish. In fact, it even makes those episodes much more disturbing and sad, totally in line with Zeta's ending. It was Bright's way to try and cope with the world after being a soldier of 2 space wars and losing many allies, and also Jura's childish perception of grown-ups and their stupid wars. Double Zeta Gundam returns to the much more serious and dramatic tone when Haman shoots Lina in the stomach, exactly when Jura loses his innocence and awakes his full new type powers. And also, a couple of episodes before that, Bright has this more or less intimate moment with Emery. She makes her love for him clear, and even though he definitely cares a lot for her, my theory is that he returns to his sanity when he remembers that he is still both married and committed to Mirai. Does this theory work perfectly? Nah, not at all. It still doesn't justify all of the stupid parts with the rights of the Argama and that weird instance of the Zeta with the Sako's head, but it makes it a little bit more manageable and interesting. And in line with what I said about the ending of the Zeta trilogy all happening in Camille's mind, imagine if in a possible Double Zeta compilation trilogy we get to see that in fact all of these stupid parts of the series are only Bright's way of seeing everything. Tomino could retcon all of the first half of the series in this way and it would be much more disturbing. But yeah, all in all, I had to come up with this super far-fetched theory just to justify all of the time spent watching the first half of Double Zeta. Aside from the mecha design of some mobile suits and a couple of characters like Ru and Kara, I didn't enjoy it. With that said, let's talk about the second half of the series where things get really serious and interesting. After the brutal first half of the series, Double Zeta starts to accelerate its rhythm. The story starts to move faster and things finally make more sense and have more depth. Villains now show us their true faces, and we learn that, just like the Titans, a certain rebel faction of Zeon is also doing human experiments just to be able to harness and control the power of new types. But more of that later. By now, Haman is starting to get fed up of all the trouble that the AUG is posing, so in a very Zeon-y tradition regarding the Antarctic Treaty as best practice only, she decides to drop a colony in Dublin, the eternal capital of Ireland and now home to the Federation's leadership. This is a very bold act of her to demonstrate Zeon's superiority, ruthlessness and willingness to do whatever it takes to destroy the opposition. The Federation, being the Federation, leaves the place without warning the civilians, and it's up to the AUG and Karaba to do something about it. And the Gundam team of the AUG learns that they have a very powerful ally willing to help them in this time of need. A more or less recovered Camille Bidan. One of the best parts of Double Zeta Gundam was seeing the recovery of Camille Bidan. And not only that, but the fact that his new type powers grew immensely, even letting him communicate telepathically with some of the pilots. Camille is integral in the defense of Dublin and the evacuation of the area. He doesn't pilot the Zeta Gundam, but in a very emotional scene, he is seen talking with Jura, where the new pilot reassures him that he will do all that he can do to save the people. And just as Amuro and Char sense that Camille was the future, he senses that, in a way, Jura has inherited his will, and he vocally responds for the first time since the beginning of the series. This is a huge deal for Camille, since that action meant that he is almost fully recovered and he has been put at ease with the knowledge that the AUG is now in good hands with Jura and the rest of the Gundam team. Being a fan of Camille, I found this part to be very interesting and fulfilling. And even though we are still in the middle of a conflict, Camille finally found peace with Fa and his soul is not being weighed down by war. But even though the Gundam team did everything they could, Dublin was still devastated by the colony drop. By now, Haman's plan to conquer the Earth and reclaim Zeon's glory is going smoothly. Or so she thinks, because sometime after the colony drop, Neo Zeon would be hit by an enemy that was so close that it was impossible to be seen: an insurrection. The rebel faction that I previously mentioned, also known as a true Neo Zeon insurrection, is led by Glemmy Toro, a young blonde soldier that first appeared as a pilot that fell in love with Ru. But as the story progressed, we learned that in fact he was plotting something very grand. To be the true leader of Zeon instead of Haman, who he thought was not doing the job as the Savis would have wanted. Glemmy is a very interesting character both inside the world and behind the scenes. Inside, we have him evolving from a goofy person who has this penchant for chivalrous theatricality to almost this cult leader that has a personal harem of cloned child cyber new type soldiers who are willing to do anything for his master. And with that, he gained enough political and military might to be a contestant for Zeon's throne. Behind the scenes or outside the story, Glemmy Toro can be considered as the first Char clone, a charismatic and blonde soldier who is able to move entire armies to his favor and change the outcome of a war. There's also a theory that suggests that Glemmy is either a clone of Gihren Savi or an in vitro child of Gihren. His backstory is not that explored in the series, and if he is or isn't related to Gihren doesn't really matter that much since he is able to reach the top without actually using that card. He relied entirely on his wits and obviously his disposable cyber new type clone army. His clones are derived from El Peple, a very little but very powerful new type who became so obsessed with Yura that entirely defected Xion to go with him. The thing is that her clones are much more brutal and cold, killing almost without any mercy as long as Glemmy orders it. And fun fact, one of the clones survives and plays a very important part in Gundam Unicorn, but we'll talk about Play 12 in another video. Back to the story, Glemmy's faction slowly but surely starts to gain traction to the point that Haman actually starts to worry about him. Not only is she facing the Ayuk, but now some of her Xion soldiers are starting to defect to Glemmy, and her dream of getting to the top is starting to crumble. So Haman now has to manage a civil war and stop the Gundam team in order for her to succeed in bringing Xion to power. And you may be wondering, hey, you have been talking a lot about Double Zeta's Gundam story and antagonist, yet there has been little to no information about the main characters, about the Ayuk pilots. What's up with that? And well, the thing is that I quite didn't like the cast members. Sorry Yura, Ino, El, Ru, Bicha and Mondo, even though you are charming in your very special way, you are definitely not as memorable as the cast of the OG Gundam or even Zeta. So even though there is character development and also some great interactions and moments with El Peple and Yura or Ru and El, for me there was nothing as memorable as Lala and Amuro or Four and Camille. That's why I won't try to talk further about them. I just didn't like them that much. And even though I will defend Bright Noah to my last breath, Double Zeta is not his finest moments. But speaking of past cast members, Amuro and Char appear in the first opening, but they never appear in the series. So why did that happen? The legend goes that originally Tomino wanted to use Char and Amuro in Double Zeta Gundam. In fact, Char was supposedly going to be the main character. Yet, as soon as the project Char's counterattack got greenlit, he discarded the idea, and now, supposedly, Tomino doesn't remember what Char was supposed to do in that story. My theory is that Char was going to be the one that started the insurrection inside Xion. Glemmy would have probably stayed as a secondary antagonist and would have never evolved to be Haman's direct opposition. I believe that the story would have played out first as a rumor that the ghost of the Red Comet was appearing to certain soldiers. Then, that same ghost would start to recruit soldiers to join the true Xion, the legitimate Xion. Then, as Haman dropped the colony, Char would reveal himself as the rebel but legitimate leader Casval Rem Daikum that implored all of Xion's soldiers to join his army to finally get rid of all of those impostors and despots that have led Xion since the demise of his father, Xion Sum Daikon. And if this sounds just like what happened in Char's counterattack, is because I totally think that Tomino, instead of all of this happening in the same Neo-Xion war with Haman, he just decided to go ahead and end with a whimper the first Neo-Xion war of Haman so that Char had a clean slate to start his war with a bang. A bang the size of an asteroid, to be exact. I truly think that Char's story arc conclusion would have been the same, just that by not appearing in Double Zeta, Tomino had a little bit more time to explore new mechanical designs, new factions inside the Federation and Xion, give more gravitas to the final conflict between Amuro and Char, and even further explore the Psycho Frame, a plot device that would be very important for future Gundam entries. On the other hand, Amuro's story would have probably stayed the same, since we can infer that he was still unwilling to go to space around the time of the events of Double Zeta Gundam. With that in mind, he then probably kept close to Karva and continued helping them. So probably what prompted Amuro to return to space was the fact that Karva was almost wiped out in the Dublin colony drop, and also that his friend Hayato was killed by Neo-Xion. This then led him to rejoin with one of his only friends and active soldier, Bright Noah, as new members of the newly created Londo Bell Task Force. But we'll explore Casval, Amuro and Londo Bell's story on another video. For now, we need to know what happened with the first Neo-Xion war. As we're approaching the end of Double Zeta, the panorama has changed enormously for Haman's Neo Zeon. She is now facing a civil war where her position as Supreme Commander is being challenged by Glemmy and his faction, and also she has to continue the fight with the AU, with the difference that the AU is now being supported by Federation forces. The Double Zeta Gundam spearheads the attack with support from the Gundam team, and they first take out Glemmy Todo and his faction, but Haman's forces were already diminished by the internal strife. And by this moment, Zeon's defeat was already inevitable. Just like in Aobaoaku, where Zeon's defeat was mostly provoked by the death of Giron Sabi by the hand of Kycilia Sabi, here Zeon's downfall was also caused by treason, by an ambition that drives everyone insane. But Jura still hoped to change Haman, and Haman was not going to give up without a fight. So finally, the Double Zeta Gundam was to engage in combat with a QLA. And here I have to point out that the fight is amazing and even symbolic to a certain extent. The mecha designs and functionality of the mobile suits contrast a lot with one another and actually speak a lot of the personalities of the pilots. The Double Zeta is a mobile suit that needed 3 pilots in order to work to the fullest, and Jura had his friends work and fight together with him, making him stronger. Contrary, the QLA is a very unique single-pilot mobile suit whose menacing, beast-like look matches Haman's brutal and dark aura, along with the fact that just as she is controlling Mineva and Zeon like a puppeteer, her mind moves the funnels with that same level of control and precision. I don't know if this was planned from the start or if it was just a coincidence, but I find it very interesting. Anyway, the fight is very well done, and Haman, staying true to her character, is not at all moved by the words of Jura. So, as she was slowly losing the upper hand of the fight, she then starts to consider killing herself instead of accepting the proposal of Jura. And here I have only one gripe. For some strange reason that is not explored very well, at some point of the story, Haman develops feelings for Jura. So, at the end of the battle, and just before she kills herself, Haman reveals that she is happy to have met Jura, possibly because Jura represented what she could have become, had she not let herself be corrupted by war. And this feels very out of character, very out of character. And yes, I know that in a spin-off manga, Char's Deleted Affairs, we learn a lot more about Haman's upbringing and the relationship with men, but this was more like a retcon. In here, it doesn't feel like a good ending for Haman, not because of her killing herself, but because she fell in love with Jura. I don't think that her pride would have let her act in that way, but maybe I'm just being nitpicky. But with all due respect, Tomino may be the creator of the real robot genre and the father of Gundam, but in my opinion, he has a lot of trouble writing women. That's really the biggest complaint I have about the outcome of the battle. But in the grander scheme of things, nobody got to see Haman at her weakest. She forever will be remembered as the cold femme fatale commander of Axis Zeon. Because really, aside from Jura, the rest of the AUG, Zeon and the Federation saw that the QLE was defeated by the Double Zeta. So now that Glemmy and Haman are out of commission, officially the Neo Zeon War is over, and there would be peace for a couple of years. But this would not be the last time that we see an uprising from the Zeon remnants. Wow, I didn't think that I could say that much about Double Zeta Gundam without mentioning the main pilots and skipping most of the first half of the series. Double Zeta is a series that starts off very slow, but it gains enough momentum to be really enjoyable at the end. The mecha design is very interesting, and even though I still prefer the Zeta over the Double Zeta, I have to say that Neo Zeon's mobile suits are very cool, at least cooler than those of the Titans and the 1 Year War. My favorite is the Bawu, and then the QLE. As for the plot, I wish I could say that you can skip the first 25 episodes, but the truth is that if you do that, then you probably wouldn't understand very well what is happening, since in the first half of the series we are introduced to all of the characters and the conflicts that would play out in the latter half. And finally, regarding the main cast of pilots and all of the Argama or Nile Argama crew, I don't know, I guess they are okay, but not as charismatic as the rest of Zeta. And don't get me wrong, Yuri is a nice guy who did his best to save his sister and end the war. But for me, he's nowhere near as memorable as Quattro or Camille. If I had to sum up the entire experience of Double Zeta, I would have to say two things. First and foremost, there really needs to be a compilation movie trilogy so that more people get to know the story in a much more accessible way. And second, it would be best if you forget the mood of the prequel series. In fact, if we imagine that the first half of Double Zeta is a sidequel or spin-off of Zeta, and it's until the second half where the direct sequel of Zeta begins, then the experience is much better. All in all, the series by its own is not bad. It's a very complete story that ties very well almost all of the loose ends left by the previous series. Also, there were even some moments that made me laugh, and the ending is one of the most optimistic in all of Universal Century. The main problem of Double Zeta Gundam is that it comes after Zeta Gundam, one of the highest points of all Universal Century. But if I'm being totally honest, I probably wouldn't watch it again. So Sunrise, if you're hearing this, please make a compilation movie trilogy. That I can definitely handle. Anyway, the next exploration of Universal Century is going to be the mythical movie Char's Counterattack. The final conflict between Amuro and Char, where two of the most well-known and fan-favorite mobile suits appear, the new Gundam and the Sasabi. And as you may or may not know, my name is Absa, and we can continue the conversation over at Twitter, where you can follow me at Absalonicus, and on Instagram, where I post pictures of my figures, my cats, and sometimes even myself. I'll be trying to talk more about anime, comics, and maybe even figures. But with that in mind, let me know in the comments what other topics would you like to hear about. Till next time, I'm Abs, and always remember that in fiction lies power, so let's use it to forge our own hero story.